Here's something that really stopped me in my tracks the other day. China's factories. They currently produce more than the next four largest manufacturing countries combined.
Wow.
Think about that. The sheer scale of it really makes you reconsider how we see the global economy, doesn't it?
It really does. And, if you look at the actual buying power, what economists call purchasing power parity, what the Chinese economy generates, it's actually already surpassed the U.S.
Right.
These aren't just like numbers on a spreadsheet. It signifies a pretty fundamental shift in global economic power.
Okay, let's really get into this then, because it wasn't always this way, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I definitely remember hearing China referred to as the bicycle kingdom, and that wasn't that long ago, relatively speaking.
Mm-hmm.
So in this deep dive, our mission, really, is to understand how this monumental transformation happened. How did China go from, that image to the global powerhouse we see today?
Oh.
We've got some fascinating material here, excerpts from articles looking specifically at this rise, plus some broader context on China's history and culture. We want to give you the crucial insights, those aha moments, without, drowning you in data.
Exactly. We'll be digging into the key decisions, the massive undertakings, the infrastructure, the global effects of this ascent, all while keeping in mind the really deep historical roots and cultural backdrop that have shaped this whole journey.
So to even begin to grasp this, we need to step back in time, don't we? I mean, China isn't some recent arrival on the world stage. It's one of the cradles of civilization.
One of the 6 ancient cradles, yeah. A history stretching back millennia. You've got those early dynasties we learn about: Xia, Shang, Zhou, Qin, Han, all flourishing in the Yellow River Basin.
And the achievements from that long history are just incredible.
Oh, absolutely. Think about things like gunpowder, paper, the Silk Road, the Great Wall. These weren't just isolated inventions. They built on centuries of knowledge and innovation. And they didn't just impact China, they profoundly shaped its neighbors and eventually lands far beyond.
Right. And that long history, it included centuries of imperial dynasties, then the Republic of China established in 1912, and then, of course, the People's Republic proclaimed in 1949.
Mm-hmm. And initially, post-49, there was that alliance with the Soviet Union. That actually helped China start building its own independent industrial base.
But it wasn't all smooth sailing after that, was it? There were some incredibly difficult periods internally.
Indeed. And it's crucial to acknowledge those. The Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, these were times of immense social, political, and economic upheaval.
Mm-hmm.
And in many ways, they kind of underscored the limitations of the existing model and arguably set the stage for why a change was eventually seen as necessary.
And that brings us to December 1978, the launch of the Reform and Opening Up policy under Deng Xiaoping. This really feels like the pivotal moment. What was the thinking behind such a radical shift?
Well, the context is absolutely key. By the late 70s, China had been, largely isolated economically for decades.
Right.
Meanwhile, you look next door, other economies in Asia, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, they were booming. There was this growing sense that China was falling behind.
Mm-hmm.
And Deng Xiaoping, known for being quite pragmatic, saw the urgent need for a new direction. It's interesting, actually. He'd briefly held power in 1975 and had already floated some reform ideas then, so the seeds were there.
Ah, okay. So it wasn't completely out of the blue in 78.
Not entirely, no. The groundwork was sort of laid, intellectually at least.
And those ideas certainly took root. Perhaps the most dramatic example is Shenzhen. Right? People always point to Shenzhen. Can you paint a picture? What was Shenzhen before all this started?
Oh, it's hard to imagine now. Back in 1979, Shenzhen was basically a small, pretty quiet fishing village, right there on the border with what was then British Hong Kong. Population maybe around 30,000 people. Very undeveloped.
30,000. That's tiny compared to today.
Oh.
So then, early 80s, it gets designated as China's first Special Economic Zone, or SEZ. What did that actually mean? What changed?
Think of it like a laboratory. It was a specific, controlled area where they could experiment with policies that were, frankly, unthinkable in the rest of China at the time, market-oriented reforms, actively encouraging foreign investment.
Okay.
It was a deliberate strategy. Let's create this specific zone, attract capital and technology from places like Hong Kong, learn how it works without disrupting the entire national system immediately.
And the results, well, they speak for themselves. Today, Shenzhen is this futuristic megacity, over 17 million people. A global tech hub, Huawei, Tencent, DJI drones, all based there.
It's mind-boggling.
Going from a fishing village to a metropolis bigger than New York City in, what, a single generation. It's incredible. What were some of the specific policies in that SEZ that made it take off like that?
Well, a few key things. They offer significant tax breaks, major incentives for foreign companies to set up shop there.
Right.
Regulations were drastically loosened compared to the rest of China. Much more autonomy for businesses, easier to import materials, export goods. It just created this incredibly attractive environment, especially for manufacturers initially moving from Hong Kong, looking for cheaper land and labor.
That makes total sense. Create a special bubble with different rules. And I assume this wasn't just a one-off experiment with Shenzhen.
No, absolutely not. Shenzhen's success was, proof of concept. So the model was replicated, other SECs were established along the coast, and then the idea sort of spread inland too. These zones became crucial engines for China's overall economic liftoff.
Which leads us right into this idea of China becoming the world's factory. The growth in manufacturing is just staggering. Give us a sense of that dominance.
The numbers are pretty stark. Go back to 2004. China was responsible for less than 9% of global manufacturing output.
That's the 9%. Okay.
Fast forward to 2023, that share jumped to nearly 29%, almost a third of everything made in the world. That's about $4.7 trillion in value.
29%.
And get this, that's more output than the US, Japan, Germany, and India combined.
More than the next four combined. Wow. Okay, that's the China shock people talk about, isn't it? This huge wave of production hitting the global market. What enabled that? How did they scale up so fast?
It was a confluence of factors, really. You had this massive pool of available labor, initially very low cost.
Right.
You had economies of scale kicking in as factories got bigger and bigger. And you definitely had significant state support investment infrastructure, policies favoring export-oriented manufacturing.
So cheap labor, scale, and government push.
Exactly. Put that together, and Chinese manufacturers could offer prices that were often impossible to beat. That led to this huge shift in global supply chains, and suddenly, the Made in China tag was absolutely everywhere.
Yeah, you couldn't miss it.
They became the world's #1 producer of, well, almost everything. Basic concrete, steel, fertilizers, but also clothes, toys, electronics, you name it.
And underpinning all that manufacturing, all that economic activity, you need infrastructure. Roads, ports, power. I've heard some wild stats about the pace of construction.
Oh, the pace was, and in many ways still is, incredible. There was that often quoted statistic for a while. China was building the equivalent of a new skyscraper every 5 days.
Every 5 days.
Yeah. And hundreds more planned or being built. But it's not just vertical. Think horizontally, too.
The railways, right?
Right.
Especially the high-speed ones.
Exactly. China now has, by far, the world's longest high-speed rail network, over 38,000 kilometers, enough to basically wrap around the Earth.
Wow.
And their total rail network is over 146,000 kilometers, second only to the U.S. globally. And then you have these massive engineering projects, like the Hong Kong-Zhuhai-Macau Bridge.
Oh, yeah, the massive sea bridge.
55 kilometers long, connecting those major economic hubs in the Pearl River Delta, even includes an underwater tunnel section. This enormous investment in infrastructure was absolutely fundamental. You can't move goods and people on that scale without it. It connected the country, facilitated trade. It's hard to overstate its importance. From the bicycle kingdom to the world's longest high-speed rail network in a few decades.
Just incredible. And the result of all this, the reforms, the manufacturing boom, the infrastructure build-out, is reflected in the GDP numbers, right? The overall economic growth has been phenomenal.
Phenomenal is the right word. For over 30 years, China averaged around 10% annual GDP growth. 10%.
That's doubling the economy every 7 years or so.
Roughly, yeah. Sustained growth like that is almost unprecedented in economic history. So you hit these milestones. 2010, overtaken Japan as the world's second largest economy in nominal U.S. dollars.
Right.
Then, around 2016, depending on the measure, surpassing the U.S. to become the largest economy in the world when measured by that purchasing power parity we mentioned earlier.
Can you just briefly explain PPP again? Why is that significant?
Sure. So nominal GDP is just the total value converted at market exchange rates. PPP tries to adjust for the fact that money buys different amounts of stuff in different countries, like a haircut costs less in Beijing than in New York.
Okay, got it.
So PPP gives a potentially better sense of the actual volume of goods and services an economy produces, its real buying power. And by that measure, China's economy is now generally considered the world's largest.
And the human impact of that growth.
Transformative. Hundreds of millions lifted out of absolute poverty. You literally have generations where grandparents lived in basic rural conditions, maybe without electricity or running water, and their grandchildren are living in modern cities, connected with amenities. It's a profound social change.
But China's focus hasn't just been internal, has it? The Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, that's a massive global project. What's the big idea behind that?
The BRI is huge. Think of it as a modern-day Silk Road, but vastly more ambitious. It's this massive push for infrastructure development and investment, connecting China with countries across Asia, Europe, Africa, even Latin America now. We're talking roads, railways, ports, pipelines, power plants, digital infrastructure.
Yeah, a lot of countries have signed up.
A huge number. As of early 2024, I think the figure was over 140 countries, representing something like 75% of the world's population.
Wow. What's in it for China? Why undertake such a massive, complex initiative?
Well, multiple strategic goals, really. It helps create new markets for Chinese goods and construction services. It helps utilize some of China's excess industrial capacity, like in steel and cement.
Ah.
It helps secure access to vital natural resources and energy supplies. And of course, it significantly increases China's political and economic influence across all these participating countries.
And often it's Chinese companies building these projects with Chinese loans, right?
That's a key aspect, yes. It often creates this sort of self-generating demand loop for Chinese capital and firms.
Okay. And beyond the hard infrastructure and economic ties, China's also been working on its soft power, hasn't it? Things like the Confucius Institutes.
Yes, the Confucius Institutes are a prime example of that. They started popping up around 2004 with the first one in Seoul, and they expanded incredibly rapidly.
How many are there now, roughly? Or were there at their peak?
At their peak, around 2017, the numbers were something like 525 institutes based within colleges and universities globally, plus over 1,100 smaller Confucius classrooms in primary and secondary schools, spread across almost 150 countries.
And their stated goal is?
Primarily to promote the teaching of the Chinese language, Mandarin, and to foster understanding of Chinese culture. They provide teachers, materials, cultural events.
How do they compare to, say, the British Council or Alliance Française?
There are similarities in the cultural promotion goal. A key difference that's often pointed out, though, is that Confucius Institutes were typically embedded directly within host universities, sometimes co-funded, which has raised questions in some countries about academic influence or autonomy.
Right, okay. So it's clear this rise has been absolutely extraordinary on multiple fronts. But, no journey like this is without its bumps in the road. We need a balanced perspective. What are some of the major challenges China is facing now, even with all this success?
Absolutely crucial to discuss. While the overall growth has been immense, it hasn't been evenly distributed. Economic inequality has become a significant issue. The Gini coefficient, the standard measure of income inequality, it's been stubbornly above most 0.4 for quite a while now.
And point 4 is generally seen as a threshold for high inequality, right?
Generally, yes. It indicates pretty significant gaps between the rich and poor. And while China's total GDP is enormous, if you look at GDP per person, per capita, it's still considerably lower than in developed nations like the US or Germany. I think the US per capita GDP is still something like 6 times higher.
So the average living standard, while vastly improved, still has a way to go to catch up with the wealthiest nations.
Exactly. That's an important distinction.
And what about other major challenges beyond the purely economic ones?
Well, there are significant environmental challenges, definitely. Decades of focus on rapid industrial growth took a heavy toll: air pollution, water pollution, soil contamination. These are serious issues they're now trying to grapple with. Then you have demographics. The legacy of the one-child policy, combined with falling birth rates more recently, means China's population is aging rapidly and the workforce is projected to shrink. That creates headwinds for future growth and puts pressure on social services.
Demographic crunch.
Yeah. And finally, as China's global footprint has grown, so have geopolitical tensions. Trade disputes, territorial claims in the South China Sea, concerns about human rights, competition over technology. Relations with the U.S. and other powers have become much more complex and, frankly, tense.
So quite a few significant hurdles to navigate. Looking ahead then, what seems to be the focus for the next chapter of China's development? Where are they aiming now?
Under the current leadership, Xi Jinping, there's a very clear emphasis on moving up the value chain, shifting from being the world's factory for low-cost goods to becoming a manufacturing power in high-tech, high-value sectors.
Things like AI, semiconductors.
Exactly. Semiconductors, artificial intelligence, electric vehicles, aerospace, biotechnology. The goal is technological self-reliance and leadership in these cutting-edge fields. Less reliance on foreign technology.
So becoming an innovation leader, not just a manufacturing follower.
That's the ambition. Now, whether they can achieve that, how they navigate all those challenges we just discussed, the inequality, the environment, demographics, geopolitics, that will really determine the trajectory.
Yeah.
But regardless of the future uncertainties, the sheer scale and, importantly, the speed of China's transformation over the last 40-odd years, it's already cemented its place as one of the most significant geopolitical and economic shifts of our lifetimes. The impact is undeniable and lasting.
Okay, let's pull this all together. We've covered a lot of ground. We've seen this incredible arc from a largely closed-off agricultural society, the bicycle kingdom, to this global manufacturing giant, an economic superpower in really just a few decades.
Yeah.
Driven by those pivotal reform and opening up policies, this relentless focus on development, building cities, factories, railways at breakneck speed, and increasingly engaging, sometimes contentiously, with the rest of the world through things like the BRI and its cultural outreach.
Precisely. A truly historic transformation fueled by specific choices, massive investment, and, well, the mobilization of hundreds of millions of people.
Right. And as we've explored this period of almost unbelievable change, it really leaves us with a final, maybe provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over. Given China's incredibly rapid rise and also acknowledging the very real challenges it's still grappling with, the internal ones, the external ones, what do you think will be the most significant ways its continued development, whatever path it takes, will reshape your world in the coming years or decades?
Yeah, think about it economically, culturally, technologically. How might it impact your job, the products you buy, the global politics you read about, the technology you use?
It really is history unfolding right before our eyes, isn't it? And figuring out its implications.
Yeah.
Well, that's something we should probably all be thinking about.